Welcome back, everyone. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy out there. This is week 11. Now, going back and looking at the syllabus, I realized that Unit 2 had been a bit of a hot mess. I did all of the lectures kind of out of order, but this last one actually matches your reading. And thankfully, we covered all of the material, just not in the order that I had set out in the syllabus. So if you've been a little confused, don't worry, we've covered all of the material. So, this week, what we're going to be looking at is Japan under the shogunate, right? So, the shogunate is going to be military rule. And we're going to start and really focus in on the Kamakura period. And then I have a couple of documentaries for you to watch after this. So we see the Kamakura period really taking off from the 12th century into the 14th century. And we can see here, and I've shown you this map before, right? The military capital of is going to be in Kamakura, so right here. Right? And so we are going to see the moving of the capital from Nara, from Kyoto, and moving it to really solidify the power of the shoguns. All right, so here's a little bit more information. We call this the era of the shoguns because although Japan is still going to have an emperor, it's really a puppet emperor, and the shoguns are going to be the ones that have the most power. Now, during from around 1156 to 1185, Japan is going to be in a civil war, right? And we're going to see a lot of these civil wars during the era of the shogunate as different families take control of the country. Now, turmoil was worsened by famine, plagues, and fires, so it's never one thing that leads to the change in power. It's usually a collection of catastrophes. And we're going to see Yorimoto gain power in 1185, and he establishes the capital at Kamakura. Right? And what we're going to see here is real Japanese feudalism, so economic and power held by military forces, and then they have their lords, and the lords have their knights, and of course in Japan those would be the samurai. You can see here early mid 14th century set of armor, and down here we have the night attack on the Sanjo Palace. So the artwork that we're going to see is going to be very different in tone than earlier art of the court in Nara and in Heian. So this is perhaps the most famous piece to come out of the shogunate, the night attack on the Sanjo Palace. It is a hand scroll. It is incredibly long, as you can see here. And it's quite hard to really analyze in a PowerPoint presentation. As you can see, from the beginning of the scroll to the end of the scroll, there is so much that is going on. And again, keep in mind, you're not reading this as a Western text. It goes from left to from right to left, sorry. And yeah, I'm going to have you watch a video on this scroll so you can kind of zoom in and they'll talk a little bit more about what's going on. But it is a hectic battle scene and it's like nothing we've seen before in terms of Japanese painting. But it does have some Yamato-e features. So you have the bird's eye view. It looks like you're looking down with the roof blown off type of angle. You're looking down at the scene. You're going to see the dramatic use of expressive colors. The red against that black is just incredibly dramatic. And energetic flowing lines, movement, action, and thrilling violence. So this is a story being told on this scroll. It's almost like you're watching a movie unfold because the story's being told as your eye moves across the scroll. So make sure you watch the video on this scroll. And then the other piece I had on that first slide there was this piece of armor. And now what's great is we have the Sanjo scroll to look at what these soldiers were wearing. And then we actually have some early armor to back that up. And so we have a really good idea of what samurai armor looked like, what it was made out of, and it really did evolve. The very early armor was much lighter. It developed into this boxier shape. The materials really were established, and the headpieces became more and more elaborate because these costumes, they weren't just meant to protect your body, but they were meant to strike fear into your enemy. Very similar to what we talked about when we mentioned the Mongols. There is a sense of psychological warfare that the samurai are wielding in these armor. Okay. So, looking at other art forms, right? So you have Buddhist iconography that becomes much more militarized, and you can see these two pieces here, and they are guardian kings. So they are guardians of the Buddhist temple, and again, we haven't really seen these in depth before. They came up a little bit when we were talking about Japanese Buddhist art, but I didn't really go into them because they really are a phenomenon of this time period. So instead of having this very peaceful sculpture of the Buddha, instead the emphasis here is on the guardians, right, holding weapons and in these dramatic poses. So the Kamakura period is known for all of its drama. And you can see here, I brought this in just so you can see the scale of these figures. It is awe inspiring, right? I mean, these are little kids, but you can see an adult there. They are still huge. And here, we can look at the differences and similarities, right? Now, I know you're at home and you don't really have anybody to share the similarities and differences with, but just think to yourself, how are these similar? So we have um, a Buddha from Nara, and then we have these guardian figures also from Nara, but from later on, right? So a later time period. All right. So hopefully a couple of the things that you thought about were kind of the seated, tranquil pose of the Buddha who was not a warrior like leader, like in other religions, right? This is kind of a peaceful preaching philosopher. And then here you have much more drama. They're standing, their hair is waving through the air, the fabric is billowing behind them. They're holding weapons. They their faces are contorted, right? You can see all of the musculature on their body. So you have a very different style developing during this time period when it comes to sculpture. Now, after the Kamakura period, you're going to have the Muromachi period, the Momoyama period, and then where we're actually going to pick up in Japan again is going to be in the Edo period. Now, just to briefly summarize what you've read in your book, during the Muromachi and Momoyama period, you're going to see new districts in Kyoto where the shoguns are going to center their power. These are going to be times of civil war and cultural splendor. So we're going to see that dynamic that we saw with the Mongols as well, where you have a society that is very warrior like, you have a lot of civil war, but at the same time, you have an amazing production of beautiful artwork, palaces, and as we're going to see in a minute, ceramics. So you're going to see elite paintings for the samurai and shogun castles. So these are going to be the very highest status positions, being a shogun or a samurai, and they're going to decorate their houses with all sorts of beautiful artwork. Right? And of course, they're going to have the taste of the military, so they're going to be very dramatic and warrior depictions and things like this. But we're also going to see Zen Buddhism influence art and culture, and I'll get to that in a second here. We're going to see lots of painting, gardens, and tea ceremonies. Now, in the Edo period, which is where we're heading, we're going to see more political stability and a policy of isolationism. And that's going to be huge for Japan, and we'll talk a lot about that. We're going to see the proliferation of ukiyo-e, so these very popular pop culture prints. And this is the Edo period Japan is really the Japan that most of us think of when we think kind of historic Japan. And so we'll be looking at that in the next unit. But I wanted to actually focus most of our lecture today on not necessarily on the art of the military, but on this other side of society that was developing at the same time, and that is tea culture and the rituals around it. Now, after this video, you're gonna have a chance to watch, like I said, the short film on the night attack at the Sanjo Palace, and I'm also gonna have you watch how a katana sword is made. I know a lot of you are fascinated by samurai culture, and we'll talk a little bit more about them during the Edo period, but this I think is going to be really interesting for you to watch, kind of how creating a katana sword, it's not just creating a weapon, but it's a complete ritual. But first, we're going to shift gears a little, and I thought this would be kind of a nice, soothing, calming topic for today. We're going to talk about the Japanese tea ceremony. And although it might seem very at odds with a militarized culture like we see in the Kamakura and the rest of the shogunates, you're actually seeing in the tea ceremony a very ritualized ceremony, and that very much falls in line with this sort of military culture that Japan develops. So this is the serving of tea, but it's ritualized, like I said before, and it symbolizes simplicity and represents the Zen principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. So this is kind of a moment of Zen in the craziness that is the shogunate and living in a militarized culture. So the tea, I'm going to kind of take you through all the steps, and then we're going to look at ceramics. So it is prepared by a tea master, and it takes about 20 years to become a tea master, which is amazing to me. But every move has rules, and so it really does take you 20 years to figure out what are all the rules. It's almost like a dance, a choreographed dance, and you need to know all of the specific rules and movements for serving the tea. The ceremony teaches harmony with the universe and tranquility. So, again, this idea of tranquility, which falls very much in line with Zen Buddhism, which takes a strong hold of Japan during this time period. So here we see a room where the tea ceremony might take place, and we're going to talk more about Japanese architecture next time we talk about Japan. So I'm going to skip here, and we're going to talk a little bit about ceramics. So for those of you that are not aware of ceramic vocabulary, because why would you be? The bottom here of a vessel is called the foot. You have the body in the center. The lip is the top part, and this is the neck. Now, some vessels have necks, some don't. Now, looking at tea's influence on ceramics. Now, tea is going to originate in China about 5,000 years ago. So it originates in China. In the 9th century, Zen Buddhist monks introduced tea to Japan from China, and the Japanese aristocracy adopted tea drinking as a social custom. So again, it's coming from the upper levels of society. Tea drinking rituals developed, requiring demand for ceramic teaware. So the movement of the body is incredibly important, but the objects in that ritual are important as well. And as we can see here, as I mentioned before, this is the foot of the vessel, the body, and the lip here. Now, in terms of aesthetic, it's affected by Chinese culture and art, as we've talked about before, but also Buddhism. And we're going to see the value of harmony in all things. So, we've talked before about Japan really being nature based and about harmony. Most of the East Asian cultures that we've looked at have this in their traditions. But what we're going to see here in Japanese aesthetics, and we talked about this way back at the beginning of the semester, is the beauty of simplicity. I mean, think about those very early haniwa, how simple they were. There was not really a need to make them super elaborate and realistic. Well, this applies to much later ceramics. And the concept of wabi sabi, wabi being the inner nature of human life, and sabi, the outer material side of life. And I'll explain that a little bit in our next slide. So, the concept behind wabi sabi is that objects are imperfect, impermanent, and simple. And I don't mean that mentally, I just mean that things are not as complicated as they seem, right? So the idea that life is imperfect and impermanent and an artwork should reflect that is very much part of wabi sabi. The idea of being modest and humble, so not like, let's not bling our bowl out. It should just be simple and beautiful and reflective of the imperfections of the natural world. They're going to embrace the unconventional. So as you can see, this vessel here, I mean, it has little bubbles on the glaze, and it's a little wobbly and lopsided, and that's okay in wabi sabi. Right? Now, it embraces the natural process, the irregular nature of ceramics, and it's unpretentious. It embraces imperfection, and this is great if you've ever done ceramics. You know, at some point, you just have to embrace the imperfect nature of making something with your hands. Now, visual matches physical appearance, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, and it correlates with a lot of these concepts that come out of Zen Buddhism and that you read about in your book. So, what is the difference here? And this is that the idea that the physical should match the purpose of the vessel. So here we have a winter tea bowl and a summer tea bowl, and this really has to do with visual weight. So the winter tea bowl, it looks much heavier because it's wider at the bottom, while the summer tea bowl seems to almost be floating because the base here, the foot of the vessel, it's much thinner. The colors used, the shapes. So it really is meant to be a vessel for a particular season, right? Remember that we talked about the seasons being incredibly important and nature, and many of these tea ceremonies were held outside or with the doors open so that it was almost that you were part of the natural world. All right. Yeah, so this, we talked a little bit about this. And I've brought in some examples of these wabi sabi Japanese bowls. And if you've ever seen kind of contemporary Japanese ceramics, they very much embrace this idea of let it be imperfect, let it be handmade. Any of you that are in the handmade kind of movement that make things kind of DIY things, you know that there is a certain beauty in having something that is made with your hands and not by a machine. Of course, at this time and period, machines didn't exist, but many contemporary Japanese artists, instead of embracing that kind of perfect modern machine made look, really embrace the handmade nature of ceramics. Here are two more. You can see there's cracks, and that's okay in Japanese ceramics. And this is very different than other cultures where perfection is the ideal. We have found thousands and thousands of vessels, for example, in Japanese pottery workshops where they are creating the best ceramics for the palace, but if they're just a little bit imperfect, they just destroy them. And thankfully, we've been able to uncover them and piece them together. But a little imperfection means you're thrown to the ground and destroyed. While in Japan, it's celebrated. So that's kind of a little difference in culture. And as we go through the years here, you're starting to see how they come from a shared culture, but they've really developed differently in terms of aesthetics. Here we have a tea tray and a vessel right here. And you can see there's no desire to create hyper realistic images here. Everything's still slightly abstracted in the way that we have seen in Japanese art and painting. And this last slide, I'm going to bring you. Our lecture today is a little short. I figured you deserved one that was a little bit short after last week. Uh, one of the things I mentioned all the way at the beginning when I started talking about the Japanese aesthetic was the idea that this embracing of imperfections is really emphasized to the point where they develop this technique of when the bowl cracks, because if you've ever done ceramics again, you know things crack in the kiln sometimes. You emphasize the imperfection with gold, right? So embracing imperfections. All right, so I think, yes, that is my last slide. I thought you would enjoy hearing about Japanese tea ceremony. And now, make sure you watch the documentary on the katana sword. It's one of my favorites, and that's kind of why I made a little bit of a shorter lecture today. And when we come back next week, I'm going to have an activity for you to do, probably not a lecture. All right. Again, stay safe out there, and I will see you next week.